Alright, now that we've reviewed the basics again in part 1, we're going to look at part 2, chunking language into thought groups and adding intonation. So I have a task that I'd like you to do first. I'd like you to press pause here in a moment and go to a YouTube clip about 2 minutes and 19 seconds long where there are some Mandarin speakers speaking English. If you can't type all of this in, or you can't hover over and get the link, go to YouTube and Google the words Chinese working hard to learn English for Olympic Games, and that will take you to the clip. Once you've gotten to the clip, I'd like you to please press pause, don't start it yet, get ready, close your eyes so you can't see the pictures and you can't read the subtitles, and just listen to the it's about 2 minutes 19 seconds, 2.5 minute clip of Mandarin speakers speaking English. Just close your eyes and listen to the sounds and how your brain attempts to process this non-native variety of English. Alright, so I'd like you to think a little bit about what happened to your brain during that listening episode. Can you notice that you sometimes try to refeed the phrase through your brain to try and make sense of it? Your brain's looking for chunks of language, units of meaning. Some of the speakers were going word by word and some were going more in a stream. And both of those are actually challenging to the listening system. So when people of other language backgrounds speak English, they don't always chunk English in the way that a native speaker of English would be expecting. We're used to hearing English uttered in set phrases, not at the single word unit and not at the sentence unit. So I'd like you to take some time and do the following task. I'd like you to listen to at least 5 different language groups read the same English passage. Again, if you can't get directly to the site, go to the web this time and Google Speech Accent Archive, and that's going to take you to a site, and on that site you can browse through the atlas, or you can actually do a search for specific language groups, and on this site all of the speakers read the same English passage, so you can listen to the way the different language groups approach English. I'd like you to notice how the units of speech differ, some people going more word by word and some blurring the delineations between words so that it sounds like a stream, and what the impact is on your listening. I'd like you to ask yourself what languages you find the easiest to process, and then is it because you happen to be familiar with that pronunciation of English, or because of the music and rhythm that you respond well to. So please press pause here and go to the web and look at some of the items on the Speech Accent Archive. Every language has some process by which utterances are divided into digestible chunks. So the human brain cannot handle too much information at one time before it needs to process it and see what it means, and so we cannot speak in a blur or a stream of speech, nor can we speak at the word level because that often doesn't capture an idea. So here's some information about English. Utterances must be divided into phrases to facilitate listener processing. You can see I'm using a single slash after each phrase and a double slash at the end of the entire utterance. Listen again. Utterances must be divided into phrases to facilitate listener processing. Here we're talking now about what is called in textbooks phrasing, thought groups, chunking. You'll see different terminology, but it's all about dividing something longer into something digestible. Point number 2 gives you the rule for how this is done. An intonation curve is used on the stressed syllable of the last content word in each phrase. Listen again and hear how I change my intonation on the last content word in each phrase, particularly on the stressed syllable. An intonation curve is used on the stressed syllable of the last content word in each phrase. If we look at point number 3, you'll hear me really focusing on the word phrases or phrases because it's ending each phrase. Phrases include subject phrases, verb phrases, object phrases, prepositional phrases, infinitive phrases, adverbial phrases, etc. And there's a rule that says every phrase must contain a content word. This is different from grammatical phrasing, where you might have a subject phrase consisting only of he or she, a pronoun. In the pronunciation phrasing, that he or she would be absorbed into the next phrase because that rule says every phrase must contain a content word. A lot of textbooks have chosen to call this process making thought groups, because each phrase or thought group or chunk answers a question or gives a piece of information that the listener may require or that the speaker wants them to process. Often these pieces answer the typical journalism who, what, where, when, how, and why questions. So for example, in our sentence, 8 years passed before she met a fellow human, we could ask what, 8 years, did what, passed, what, before she met, who, a fellow human. 8 years passed before she met a fellow human. In sentence B, I'm sorry, it says sentence A there, it felt as if she was in a world of her own. It what? It felt as if what? As if she was in a world. What kind of world? And that says word. I apologize again. It's obviously getting late. Of her own. It felt as if she was in a world of her own. So as I mentioned, the tradition is to use a slash after each phrase and a double slash at the sentence end. The reason that there's a double slash at the sentence end is that the intonation curve is even stronger there, showing the end of a larger unit of speech. So if you look at sentence A there, 8 years passed before she met a fellow human. Those are places where I could naturally pause, but of course I would only pause in normal speech if I was being dramatic or trying to elicit more of a response. Normally I would let my intonation do the work on the thought groups, and I would say, 8 years passed before she met a fellow human. B, it felt as if she was in a world of her own. It felt as if she was in a world of her own. Notice that we can combine thought groups that are simple to process, but newcomers to English are best to start with most basic phrase divisions for practice. Longer units take practice to say. So for example, in D, I would divide she gave birth to the baby in the hospital downtown into she gave birth to the baby in the hospital downtown for ESL students, but as a native speaker I would say she gave birth to the baby in the hospital downtown. So dividing up into smaller units, as long as they are a thought unit, is best for practicing at the beginning and then work on longer units afterwards. And once again, these units answer questions that the mind would have about what's going on. So if we look at how English is normally phrased, or what's called default phrasing, we normally emphasize the final content word in each phrase the most. But this is not always. Again, with everything in pronunciation, we do what we want to do in order to communicate what we want. And if I've already mentioned something, I may not emphasize the last content word. I have to apologize for my dog chewing his bone there. I tried a few attempts to get him to do other things, and he's not cooperating, and I do want to get this done tonight. So my apologies. So A, 8 years passed before she met a fellow human. Human would probably be what I'm emphasizing there. And B, it felt as if she was in a world of her own. Probably own would be quite strong there. But again, I could make B, it felt as if she was in a world of her own. And the felt would be the stronger intonation and stress marker. So these words will take an intonation curve, with the strongest being at the double slash by default, but it can be otherwise, and you'll notice that when you're listening to segments of speech. So we're going to look at some sentences about my daughter, because I'm kind of missing her. She's off in Vancouver right now, and this is what was used for an introduction, so it is something that is meant to be read aloud, and I think that's important when you're choosing things for intonation, that it is something that was meant to be read aloud, like a dialogue or a speech or poetry even. And so I'd like you to press pause, and I'd like you to try dividing these 6 sentences up into what you consider to be the possible chunks or spoken phrases. Okay, before we go on and look at all of the answers, number 1 bears a little bit of analysis. Number 1 says, Alicia Sarah Berlinger is a Canadian musician. So who is what, basically. And you might have wondered what to do with the is, because normally a verb phrase stands alone, but only if there's a main verb. Remember, a spoken phrase or thought group must always contain a content word, so the is then is absorbed in the following phrase, not the one before. So I would say Alicia Sarah Berlinger is a Canadian musician. Notice that the last content word in the phrase is strongest by default due to the way English functions, but an earlier phrase can be stronger if the info is not new. For example, if I had 2 sentences, Alicia Sarah Berlinger is a musician, the next one would be she's a Canadian musician. I wouldn't put emphasis again on musician because it's not new information for you as the listener. Alright, so let's have a look at how you divided the sentences and how I divided the sentences. Number 1, Alicia Sarah Berlinger is a Canadian musician. 2 phrases. Number 2, she was born in Mississauga, Ontario and raised in Kitchener, Ontario. 4 phrases. Number 3, she started singing in her early teens in local bands and at various festivals, including the Kitchener Blues Festival, where she was the 2008 winner of the Grand River Youth Legacy Contest. Now that's a pretty long sentence, and even I ran out of breath, but I think the divisions are pretty solid there. Definitely with an ESL class, rather than with you guys who are TESOL students, I would use much shorter sentences. Number 4, Berlinger briefly attended Humber College's jazz program in Toronto while playing local gigs and building a fan base. So we've got thought groups or meaning groups there. Number 5, in 2010, she was signed to Universal and has begun recording her first full-length album. So listen again and see if you can hear the phrases there. And you can pause between each one, but again, it's not normally done in speech. In 2010, she was signed to Universal and has begun recording her first full-length album. And number 6, Berlinger was a featured performer at the 2010 Kitchener Blues Gala. And again, because some words were mentioned before, they didn't take the major emphasis this time. So if you go back and look at that, you can see that that's a feature of phrasing as well.